The envelope landed on the polished conference table with a soft sound that somehow felt louder than a gunshot. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody even breathed normally. At the head of the table, the company's billionaire CEO leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the woman standing across from him as if she were a problem he had already decided to solve. She was 34 years old, dressed in a simple navy blue blouse and modest black trousers, her hands trembling slightly around an old, creased envelope. She had walked into that room expecting to lose her job. She had no idea that within the next 10 minutes, the most powerful man in the company would be forced to confront a truth that money could never erase. The CEO glanced at the envelope, then at her tired face, and gave a cold, amused smile. "I'll pay you $1 million to read that letter," he mocked, certain that the document inside was nothing more than another desperate employee's attempt to save herself. What he didn't know was that the letter had been written 17 years earlier, by the one person whose memory he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can change a life, that people deserve second chances, and that sometimes the smallest act of compassion can create the biggest difference, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to people who believe that goodness still matters. The woman's name was Clara Bennett, and for most of her adult life, she had learned how to survive without asking anyone for help. She had grown up in a small apartment above an old bakery on the east side of the city, where the smell of warm bread often drifted through the cracked windows in the early morning. Her mother had worked long shifts cleaning offices, while her father had disappeared from their lives when Clara was only 9. There had never been much money, but there had always been enough love. Her mother used to tell her that a person's worth was never measured by what they owned, but by what they were willing to give when they had almost nothing left. Clara carried those words with her into adulthood. At 34, Clara was a single mother raising an 8-year-old daughter named Lily. She worked as an executive assistant at Whitmore Industries, a company large enough to occupy half of a downtown skyscraper. Every morning, she left home before sunrise, prepared Lily's breakfast, packed her school lunch, and quietly checked the balance in her bank account before stepping outside. There were always bills waiting: rent, electricity, groceries, school expenses, her mother's medication. Somehow Clara managed to keep everything moving, even when she felt as though one unexpected expense could bring her entire world crashing down. She had worked at Whitmore Industries for 6 years. She was not the highest paid employee, and nobody called her brilliant, but she was dependable. She remembered birthdays. She stayed late when others went home. She helped new employees learn the company systems. She quietly fixed mistakes before executives ever noticed them. When someone was sick, she covered their work. When someone was overwhelmed, she brought them coffee and stayed beside them until the crisis passed. Clara never expected applause. She simply believed that if you could make someone's difficult day a little easier, you should. The company's CEO, Daniel Whitmore, was known for being the opposite. At 43, he was one of the youngest billionaires in the city. He had built the company from a small technology firm into a global corporation worth billions. Newspapers called him ruthless. Business magazines called him brilliant. Employees called him intimidating when he could not hear them. Daniel rarely smiled, rarely apologized, and almost never allowed emotion into business decisions. To Clara, he was simply the man whose calendar she managed. Their interactions had always been brief. She would place reports on his desk. He would nod. She would remind him about meetings. He would say thank you without looking up. But there was something strange about Daniel that Clara had noticed over the years. Whenever the subject of his childhood came up, his expression changed. His jaw tightened. His eyes became distant. It was as though an invisible door had slammed shut inside him. Clara never asked why. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning, everything changed. Clara arrived at the office carrying Lily's forgotten science project in one hand and her work bag in the other. She had barely stepped out of the elevator when she noticed 3 senior executives standing outside Daniel's office. They were whispering. When they saw her, they immediately stopped. Her stomach tightened. Inside the office, Daniel stood near the windows with his back to her. A thick folder lay open on his desk. His expression was harder than usual. Clara placed the science project on a side table and asked if he needed anything. Daniel turned around and told her she had been accused of leaking confidential company information. For a moment, Clara thought she had misunderstood him. She had never leaked anything. The accusation involved a confidential investment document that had appeared in the hands of a competitor. Someone had apparently accessed the file using credentials connected to Clara's employee account. The evidence looked convincing. Her login had been recorded. Her password had been used. The document had been downloaded from her workstation late at night. But Clara had not been in the office that night. She had been home with Lily. She explained everything calmly. She offered to show her phone records. She offered to provide her home security footage. She asked them to check the building cameras. Daniel listened without changing his expression. Then he told her that the company could not afford to make exceptions. Clara felt the floor disappear beneath her. She thought about rent. She thought about Lily's school. She thought about the medicine sitting in her kitchen cabinet. And most painfully, she thought about how hard she had worked to earn the tiny bit of security they were now taking away in a single sentence. Still, she did not beg. She simply asked for one opportunity to prove she was innocent. Daniel looked at her for several seconds before telling security to escort her from the building. Clara returned to her desk and began packing her belongings. She placed her notebooks into a small cardboard box. Then her framed photograph of Lily. Then a tiny green plant that a coworker had given her years earlier. She stood there silently, fighting tears. Around her, people pretended not to stare. One colleague lowered her eyes. Another whispered that Clara had always seemed trustworthy. But nobody stepped forward. That was the cruelest part. Not the accusation. Not the termination. The loneliness. Clara carried the box toward the elevator. As the doors opened, she looked back at the office where she had spent 6 years of her life. She did not curse anyone. She did not threaten anyone. She simply whispered to herself that someday, the truth would have a way of finding its way into the light. Then she walked away. For 3 days, Clara searched for work. She sent resumes to dozens of companies. She attended interviews. She heard polite rejections. One employer offered her a position but withdrew it after contacting Whitmore Industries. Her savings disappeared quickly. Lily noticed that her mother had stopped buying coffee. Then she noticed the smaller grocery bags. Then she noticed that her mother was smiling less. One evening, Lily sat beside Clara at the kitchen table and asked whether they were going to lose their home. Clara froze. A mother can survive many things. But hearing fear in her child's voice can break something inside her. Clara hugged Lily and promised everything would be okay. After Lily went to bed, Clara sat alone in the dark kitchen. She opened the last drawer. Inside was a small metal box that had belonged to her mother. Clara had not opened it in years. Her mother had died 2 years earlier, leaving Clara almost nothing except photographs, a few letters, and memories. That night, Clara opened the box. Beneath several old photographs was an envelope. Her name was written on the front. Not her mother's handwriting, someone else's. Clara turned the envelope over. There was no return address. Only one sentence written across the back. For the day when the truth finally matters. Clara stared at it for a long time. Then she opened it. Inside was a letter dated 17 years earlier. The letter was written by a man named Thomas Whitmore. Daniel Whitmore's father. Clara read the first paragraph and felt her hands begin to shake. Thomas Whitmore had known Clara's mother. More than that, he had known Clara. He had met her when she was 17. And according to the letter, he had promised her mother that he would help Clara attend college. But that promise had never been fulfilled. Clara kept reading. The truth was far more complicated. 17 years earlier, Thomas Whitmore had discovered that one of his senior executives was stealing from the company. The executive was powerful, connected, and dangerous. Thomas had planned to expose him. But before he could do it, Thomas became seriously ill. The letter explained that he had asked Clara's mother to protect a collection of documents that could expose the theft. He had also written something else. Something that made Clara's heart stop. Thomas believed that his own son, Daniel, would one day become CEO. He feared Daniel would inherit not only the company, but also the false story that had destroyed the family. The letter contained instructions. If Daniel ever became a powerful man, the truth had to be placed in his hands. Not through a lawyer. Not through the board. Through someone who would not be intimidated by money. Clara read the final page. Her mother had apparently kept the letter all these years because Thomas had asked her to wait until the right moment. But why had she never told Clara? Clara remembered her mother's final weeks. She remembered how often her mother had said that some truths were dangerous when revealed too early. Now Clara understood. The next morning, Clara returned to Whitmore Industries. She was not there to beg for her job. She was there to deliver the letter. Security nearly stopped her at the entrance, but Clara asked to see Daniel personally. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps Daniel simply wanted to prove that he had nothing to fear. He allowed her upstairs. That was how Clara ended up standing inside the executive conference room surrounded by lawyers, board members, and senior executives. She placed the old letter on the table. Daniel picked it up. He recognized his father's handwriting immediately. His face changed. Clara told him where she had found it. Daniel asked why she had never brought it to him before. Clara explained that she had not known it existed. The room became silent. Then Daniel asked what was inside. Clara told him he should read it himself. Daniel refused. He said he had no interest in old family stories. Clara looked at him calmly. She told him that if he wanted to know why his father had trusted a 17-year-old girl's mother with the truth, he should open the letter. Daniel leaned back. Then, with a bitter smile, he said the sentence that would later haunt him. He told Clara that if the letter was so important, he would pay her $1 million to read it aloud. He said it mockingly. He expected her to be desperate. He expected her to jump at the money. He expected everyone in the room to laugh. Nobody did. Clara slowly picked up the envelope. She looked at Daniel. Then she said that she did not want his money. She wanted him to understand what his father had tried to protect. And then she began reading. Her voice was quiet, but every word seemed to strike the room like thunder. Thomas Whitmore wrote that he had spent years building his company but had nearly destroyed his family by believing that money could solve every problem. He admitted that he had trusted the wrong people. He admitted that Daniel had grown up believing that strength meant never showing weakness. He admitted that he had failed his son. Then came the part that froze Daniel completely. Thomas revealed that years earlier, Clara's mother had saved his life. She had found him after a serious accident outside a remote highway and stayed with him until help arrived. Thomas had promised to repay her. She had refused. She only asked him to help children in need when he had the opportunity. Thomas had later helped fund a small scholarship program anonymously. Clara's own education had been partially supported by that fund. She had never known where the money came from. Thomas wrote that Clara's mother had once told him something he never forgot. She said that if you help someone only because you expect something in return, you are not being generous. You are making an investment. Thomas wrote that he wanted Daniel to understand that distinction. Then the letter revealed the final secret. The confidential document that had supposedly been leaked from Clara's computer had not been stolen by her. It had been taken by a senior executive named Richard Hale. Richard had been working with a competitor for years. Thomas had suspected him. Daniel's father had begun investigating him 17 years earlier. And Richard was still working at Whitmore Industries. The room went completely silent. Daniel slowly looked around the table. Richard Hale was sitting 3 seats away. His face had gone pale. Daniel demanded the security team check the old access logs. Within minutes, the room filled with movement. Computers were opened. Records were examined. Emails were pulled. And then the truth appeared. Richard had accessed Clara's credentials remotely. He had manipulated the system to make it appear as though she had downloaded the file. The evidence that had destroyed Clara's career had been manufactured. Daniel stood motionless. For the first time in years, the Billionaire CEO looked powerless. He looked at Clara, then at the letter, then at Richard, and suddenly the entire story of his father, his company, his childhood, and his own behavior began to make sense. Richard had been one of the people closest to Daniel's father. He had helped convince Daniel for years that his father had been weak. He had encouraged Daniel to become ruthless. He had benefited from Daniel's distrust. And now his scheme was collapsing. Security escorted Richard from the room. But Clara did not celebrate. She simply stood there holding the letter. Daniel walked toward her. His voice was different now. He apologized. Not as a CEO. Not as a billionaire. As a man who had finally realized the damage he had caused. He told Clara that she had been right to refuse his money. He said he had spent his entire life believing that money gave him control over everything. But there was one thing money could never purchase. Trust. Clara looked at him with tired eyes. She told him that she did not want revenge. She wanted her name cleared. She wanted her daughter to know that her mother had never stolen anything. Daniel promised that it would be done publicly. And it was. The company issued a formal statement clearing Clara of every accusation. Her termination was reversed. The executive responsible for the fraud was prosecuted. But Daniel did something nobody expected. He offered Clara the position of director of a new foundation. The foundation would provide scholarships, emergency assistance, and career opportunities to people who had lost jobs unfairly or faced financial hardship. Clara almost refused. Then she remembered her mother. She remembered the old bakery. She remembered the words about helping people without expecting anything in return. So she accepted. Months later, Clara stood inside a newly renovated community center funded by Whitmore Industries. Children were reading books. Young adults were learning technology skills. Single parents were receiving career support. And on the wall was a small plaque. It carried no billionaire's name. It carried no corporate logo. It simply said, "A helping hand should never ask how much the other person can give back." Daniel stood quietly behind Clara. He told her that his father had spent his final years trying to become a better man. Daniel admitted that he had spent years trying to become the kind of man his father wanted him to be. But he had misunderstood the lesson. Strength was not refusing to feel. Strength was admitting when you were wrong. Clara smiled. She told him that perhaps that was why the letter had survived all those years. Not to destroy him, to give him one final chance. Years later, Lily would sometimes tell people about the day her mother came home after losing everything. She would tell them that her mother had walked through the front door carrying a cardboard box and somehow still managed to smile. She would tell them that her mother had taught her that dignity was worth more than money. And she would tell them about the billionaire who once mocked a letter by offering $1 million to hear it read aloud. But the part Lily remembered most was what happened afterward. Because Daniel never forgot that moment. And neither did Clara. The letter was eventually placed inside a glass display case at the foundation. Not because it was valuable. Not because it had belonged to a billionaire. But because it reminded everyone who entered the building that sometimes the truth arrives quietly. Sometimes it comes in an old envelope. Sometimes it is carried by someone the world has overlooked. And sometimes the person standing in front of you, trembling because she has been hurt and misunderstood, is carrying something far more powerful than money. She is carrying the truth. Clara never became obsessed with wealth. She never bought a mansion. She never tried to prove anything to the people who had once doubted her. Instead, she used her position to help people who reminded her of herself. People who had been rejected. People who